Hello, this is still Tim Maudlin, still Professor of Philosophy at NYU and Director of the John Bell Institute for the Foundations of Physics. Still healthy, thank goodness, still in lockdown in New York. No longer at the department at NYU because all of that has been closed. So now I'm just here in my son's room where I put up a whiteboard, and so it's going to be a little bit harder to get all the information out. And I thought it would be useful to update a little bit on where we are and to talk about a few more concepts that will be helpful for understanding where we're going with the pandemic, what we should expect, what we should be doing, and so on. So last time we talked about these two scenarios here. This scenario with very good social distancing, where an infected person would pass on the disease to just one other person a day, who would then pass it on to one person, and so on. And so after 30 days, we ended up with 30 people infected. And in the not so good social distancing situation, one infected person would infect two, each of those would infect two, and then just as a purely mathematical fact, if that went on for 30 days, you would have 1 billion people infected. And that was to understand the importance of social distancing and isolation, and even what might seem to be a rather small change from 1 to 2 and how that compounds. Now, there's a piece of technical terminology I didn't mention, which is useful here. It's called R, or the replication rate, and that is just on average how many people does each infected person go on to infect. So this scenario is R equals 1, and this scenario is R equals 2. In fact, for the coronavirus, when it was growing, the R rate was probably around 1.3, 1.2, which means that you wouldn't get the effect quite this quickly. You would get it eventually if you could keep infecting. And the other thing is, of course, after a while, once everybody's sick, you just can't make more people sick because everybody's already ill. And so the numbers will have to tail off at that point. Now, fortunately, in New York, at this point, we are on the downside, and things are getting better rather than worse every day. And that's because the R value can go below 1. If you're at 1, then things are just going to chug along at the same rate of infection. And if you're above 1, they're going to explode exponentially. And if you're below 1, they can decrease as dramatically as they increased. So, of course, no one can literally infect a fraction of a person, but if out of 2 infected people, they only give rise to 1 new infection, then we would have an R rate of 1/2. And what would happen when we drive R below 1? Well, that's easy to see, because if we had R equals 1/2, then we would just get this scenario backwards. If you started with 1 billion infected people, after 1 day they would infect 500 million more. They would then infect 250 million more, and after the same 30 days, you'd get back to having only 1 new infection. So you could, in principle, drive the virus down as dramatically as it naturally wants to drive itself up. It turns out that although we are at R less than 1 in New York, we are not as much below 1 as we were originally above 1, so we're going down more slowly than we came up. But we are going down, and as long as R stays below 1, we will continue to go down and approach a situation where the hospitals are no longer overwhelmed, and there's many fewer people who have to be admitted into ICUs, and everything can stay within the capacity of the medical system. So we're very, very happy about that. Now, there's a concept that's being talked about that I think is sometimes misunderstood, which is worthwhile talking about, which is herd immunity. So often people will say that the ultimate thing we're trying to achieve is herd immunity. Now, herd immunity can be misunderstood. it sounds like a person can become immune from the people around them in just the same way that a person can become sick from the people around them being sick. As if the immunity of people around you can be transmitted to you. And sometimes people talk this way, as if literally immune people can share their antibodies through the herd. That can't happen. That is not going to happen. All that herd immunity means is that enough people have gotten the disease or have gotten a vaccine and are immune to it, so they can no longer be carriers. They can no longer get the disease, and then more importantly, they can no longer transmit the disease. So let's suppose we hit a point where 50% of the population were immune. Then we can look at this case, the R equals 2 case, and we'll just now put little green circles around the immune people. So now we've got about 50% of the people immune. And what you immediately see is that if these people are immune, then this case becomes essentially like this case. It just means that you're going to come into contact with fewer and fewer people who could give you the disease, and fewer people who you could give the disease to in exactly the same way. So getting enough of the population immune will have an effect, essentially exactly the same effect that social distancing and isolation has. But you have to get to very, very, very high levels of immunity for that to happen. And if the only way to get that immunity is to get all those people sick, you're going to have quite a few people sick and dying. And what we all hope is that we could get that immunity rather through a vaccine. And so what we want is for there to be a kind of Manhattan Project or space shot project to produce and test vaccines for corona as quickly as possible. And until then, all we can do is try to reduce the rate of transmission in ways that we have been doing and that have been effective, and hopefully in ways that are less intrusive if we can manage to do that safely. Now, there's another concept I think is probably worth talking about, which is just the whole idea of how dangerous the disease is. So you'll hear people asking, is it more or less dangerous than the flu or than the Spanish flu? And the idea, the suggestion is that this is a discussion of the virus, but it's not just of the virus. The virus plays a role in how dangerous it is, and other things play a role in how dangerous it is. And some of those we have direct control over, and some of them we don't. So if you think about the steps that get you from one person having the disease to another person dying of it, which is what we're worried about, or getting extremely ill from it, there are different characteristics that go into that. One is about the virus itself. How easily is it transmissible between two people, say, in the same room? How long does it last if it happens to land on a surface and someone else touches the surface later? So that you really need to study the virus to find out about. A virus can be more or less transmissible, and this looks like a pretty transmissible virus, easy to catch in the same circumstances. Of course, we can then interfere with that by cleaning up the surfaces, by staying away from each other, by wearing masks. That reduces the transmissibility of the virus without changing the virus at all. Then you get to the point of, once you have a transmissibility, you now have a certain number of people who are going to be infected. How many of those are going to get seriously ill? That's a matter now of the disease, of the virus, and how it affects the human body on average in different people. Some people apparently can get it and be asymptomatic. Other people have very annoying but not fatal reaction to it. Some people obviously have to go to the hospital. Some people die. Part of that is how bad the disease is and the effect it has on the body. Another part of that is how good the medical system is. And that's why it was so important to keep the number of seriously ill people within the range that the medical system could deal with. And that's what we came very close to overrunning in New York. We didn't quite overrun it, but we could have. It was like watching the floodwaters rise against a levee and seeing they're going up so fast that it's very likely the whole thing is going to break and you're piling up sandbags as fast as you can. In fact, we were able, through distancing and isolation, to stop the rise and to drive R from above 1 to -1, and now the waters are receding. So it can be done. But there's really no sense of just trying to pin a number to how dangerous the virus is, because the virus itself can be the same, but in different circumstances can have different degrees of deadliness. Where are we going to end up with this? Well, certainly until we have a vaccine, we're going to be in very much the same situation we've been, at least in general. Remember, this whole thing started only 6 months ago with one person on the face of the earth with the disease. And now there are millions. Every single person with the virus is the source, can be the source of a new wave. So even if we get the numbers very much down, so many fewer people are getting sick and many fewer people are dying and we feel much better, we can't stop what we're doing. We can't stop the mitigation. We may be able to loosen it in reasonable steps, taking into account the dangers, taking into account the benefits, but we can't just go back the way we were, or this will start all over again. In the case of the Spanish flu, the second wave was much more deadly than the first. So as frustrating as it is to have to continue these sorts of isolation measures, especially when you don't see a lot of sickness around you, you have to remember that it's because of the isolation measures that you don't see a lot of sickness around you. And as Justice Ginsburg said in a different context, to stop isolation now would be like throwing away your umbrella in the middle of a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. It's the measures that we've taken that have stemmed the tide, that have brought it down, and that we're going to have to keep in place at least until we have a vaccine. So I hope everybody is staying well, and I hope there's appreciation of how much hard work has gone into making this now a kind of problem that can be addressed, maybe without complete and total destruction, but everybody should still be taking it very seriously and should resign themselves to take it seriously for quite a long time to come. Stay well, and maybe I'll talk to you again.